The afternoon sun draped Sycamore Lane in a drowsy warmth, the kind that made the air thick and the leaves droop on the ancient oaks lining the street. Howard Caldwell, perched on the edge of his worn armchair, sipped lukewarm iced tea, the clinking of the ice a lonely sound in the quiet house. He'd lived on Sycamore Lane for 42 years, long enough to know the rhythm of the place, the ebb and flow of familiar faces, the predictable dance of daily routines. That was why the sight of the man across the street, standing silently before the vacant Peterson house, sent a prickle of unease down his spine. The man was tall, black, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in the languid afternoon heat. He just stood there, hands clasped in front of him, as if studying the peeling paint of the porch. Howard shifted in his chair, the worn leather creaking beneath him. He told himself it was nothing, just a man admiring a house, perhaps considering buying it. But the unease persisted, a low hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He'd seen this man before, hadn't he? Or someone like him. The thought was vague, a fleeting impression he couldn't quite grasp. He took another sip of tea, the sweetness cloying on his tongue. It wasn't the suit, not exactly. It was the way the man held himself, the stillness, the otherness. Howard knew he shouldn't be thinking like this. His daughter, Sarah, would be appalled. She'd been on him for years about his preconceived notions, as she called them. But something about the man, something in the way he simply stood there, sent a shiver of apprehension through him. He watched him for another few minutes, the silence amplifying his anxiety. Each second that ticked by felt like a confirmation of his unease. He knew Mrs. Peterson wouldn't be back for weeks. What was this man doing just standing there? The internal debate raged within him, a war between his ingrained suspicion and the nagging voice of his daughter's reason. Finally, the suspicion won. He reached for the phone, the cool plastic a stark contrast to the sweat beading on his palm. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the house. He dialed 911, his breath catching in his throat. 911, what is your emergency? Yeah, this is Howard Caldwell, he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in his hand. 14, Sycamore Lane. He paused, his gaze fixed on the man across the street, who hadn't moved an inch. There's a suspicious man outside the vacant house across the street, the Peterson place. Can you describe him, sir? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Howard swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. Tall black guy in a suit. He realized how flimsy his description sounded, how it lacked any real substance. He added hastily, it doesn't look right. Okay, sir. We'll send a unit over to investigate. Howard hung up the phone, a wave of relief washing over him. He'd done the right thing. He was protecting his neighborhood, his community. He watched as a police cruiser pulled onto Sycamore Lane, its flashing lights cutting through the drowsy afternoon. Two officers emerged, their movements brisk and purposeful. One, a stocky man with a weathered face, approached the man in the suit. The other, younger, lingered near the car, hand resting on his holster. Howard watched from his window as the stocky officer, Officer Bradley Monroe as he'd later learned, spoke to the man. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see the officer's posture stiffen, his hand moving towards his belt. He saw the man in the suit produce something from his pocket, a flash of silver in the sunlight. Howard's heart clenched. A gun? He held his breath, bracing himself for the sound of gunfire. But the sound never came. Instead, he saw Officer Monroe's hand drop away from his belt, his shoulders slumping slightly. He exchanged a few words with the younger officer, Jason Whitaker, their faces etched with confusion. Then, Officer Monroe turned and gestured toward Howard's house. A knot of dread tightened in Howard's stomach. What was going on? He watched as the two officers approached his front door, their steps heavy on the pavement. He rose from his chair, his legs suddenly weak. He opened the door before they could knock, a forced smile plastered on his face. "Afternoon, officers," he said, his voice a little too high-pitched. "Everything all right?" Officer Monroe's gaze was steady, unnervingly so. "Sir, can you tell us why you called 911? Howard swallowed, the lump in his throat growing larger. He gestured vaguely across the street. That man, he just seemed out of place. Officer Monroe's lips tightened. "Sir, that man is Leonard Briggs, our new chief of police." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Howard felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and clammy. Chief Briggs, the man he had reported as suspicious. He stared at the officers, his mind struggling to process the information. He stammered, "Chief, I didn't know." Chief Briggs stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He looked at Howard, his eyes dark and deep, holding a universe of unspoken words. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the weight of the unspoken. Howard wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the shame burning in his cheeks, the guilt churning in his gut. Chief Briggs finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but resonant. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his gaze never wavering, "I believe we have something to discuss." Then he turned and walked back across the street, his silhouette stark against the setting sun, leaving Howard standing on his porch, grappling with the devastating weight of his own prejudice. The quiet hum of the afternoon had returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the hum of a community forced to confront the ugliness hidden beneath the surface, the quiet rumble of an awakening that would forever change the landscape of Sycamore Lane. The late afternoon sun cast long, languid shadows across Sycamore Lane, painting the manicured lawns in hues of amber and gold. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the towering oaks, a deceptive serenity that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. Two police cruisers, their sirens silent, but their presence screaming, pulled up abruptly in front of the vacant Caldwell house. Red and blue lights pulsed, bathing the scene in an unsettling glow. Howard Caldwell, his heart still hammering against his ribs, watched from his porch, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He'd imagined this moment, the swift arrival of law enforcement, the restoration of order. Yet, seeing it unfold, a prickle of something unfamiliar, something akin to shame, began to creep into his conscience. He shifted his weight, the wicker of his porch chair creaking beneath him, the sound strangely loud in the sudden stillness. The black man, the object of his anxious call, remained unmoved. He stood bathed in the flashing lights, his posture relaxed, his hands loosely clasped behind his back, as though admiring the architecture of the empty house. The casualness of his stance unnerved Howard. Wasn't he aware of the gravity of the situation? Didn't he realize he was the subject of suspicion? This nonchalance, this defiance, fueled the embers of Howard's initial fear. Two officers emerged from the cruisers, their movements swift and practiced. Officer Monroe, a stocky man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense air, led the way. His hand instinctively rested on his holster as he approached. Officer Whitaker, younger, his face still carrying a trace of youthful idealism, followed close behind, his gaze flickering between the black man and Howard on the porch. Monroe's boots crunched on the gravel driveway, the sound amplifying the silence that had fallen over the street. Howard watched, his breath catching in his throat, as the two officers stopped a few feet from the man. "Afternoon, sir," Monroe began, his voice firm but polite. He subtly adjusted his stance, widening his legs, a subconscious assertion of authority. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" The black man turned his head, his expression unreadable in the shifting light. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Howard felt a strange jolt, a flicker of recognition that he couldn't quite place. The man's gaze held a depth that seemed to penetrate Howard's carefully constructed facade of composure. He swallowed, the lump in his throat growing larger. "My name is Briggs," the man said, his voice smooth and resonant, cutting through the tension like a finely honed blade. "I'm a new chief of police for this town." The words hung in the air, suspended in the swirling red and blue lights. Time seemed to stretch, distorting the reality of the moment. Officer Monroe froze, his hand still hovering near his holster, his eyes widening in disbelief. Whitaker's jaw slackened slightly, his youthful features etched with confusion. A wave of discomfort washed over Howard, leaving him feeling exposed, vulnerable. He gripped the arms of his chair, the wicker digging into his palms. He'd called the police on the chief of police. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He could feel the blood draining from his face, leaving him cold and clammy. His carefully constructed narrative, the story he'd told himself about protecting his neighborhood, crumbled into dust. Monroe cleared his throat, the sound awkward and strained. The casual authority he'd projected moments before evaporated, replaced by a palpable unease. He shifted his weight again. This time the movement seemed less assertive, more like a nervous tick. "Chief Briggs," he stammered, his eyes darting towards Whitaker as if seeking confirmation. His internal monologue was a whirlwind of confusion. He'd seen the picture, of course, the official announcement, but the reality of the man standing here in his jurisdiction in a suit in front of a vacant house hadn't aligned with the mental image he'd formed. An image shaped by years of ingrained biases, of preconceived notions about who belonged where and how they should behave. Whitaker remained silent, his eyes fixed on Chief Briggs, a mixture of embarrassment and dawning comprehension swirling within him. He'd been on the force for 5 years, long enough to witness the subtle, insidious ways prejudice seeped into their daily routines. He'd often felt the discomfort, the internal conflict between his duty to uphold the law and the unspoken code that often dictated who the law was truly meant to protect. Seeing his superior officer, a black man in a position of power, subjected to the same suspicion he'd witnessed countless times directed at others, a wave of shame washed over him. Chief Briggs' expression remained unchanged, a mask of calm amidst the swirling emotions of the officers. He observed them, his gaze steady and unwavering. He knew the assumptions they'd made, the whispers that likely preceded his arrival. He'd seen it all before, the subtle shifts in demeanor, the veiled suspicion that lurked beneath the surface of polite interactions. He'd chosen this moment, this seemingly insignificant encounter, to expose the rot that festered beneath the veneer of respectability in this town. Howard, from his vantage point on the porch, felt the weight of Chief Briggs' gaze. It wasn't accusatory, not exactly. It was something far more profound, something that stripped away the layers of self-justification and laid bare the ugliness of his prejudice. Shame, hot and suffocating, rose in his chest. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the realization of his own complicity. He'd seen a black man in a suit, standing in front of a vacant house, and his mind had filled in the blanks, painting a narrative of suspicion and danger. He'd reacted not out of genuine concern, but out of fear, out of the ingrained prejudices that had taken root deep within him. The silence stretched, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rhythmic pulse of the police lights. A silent confrontation, a reckoning played out in the stillness of the afternoon. Finally, Chief Briggs turned, his gaze lingering on Howard for a moment longer before he walked toward his own car, a sleek, unmarked sedan parked a short distance away. He opened the door, the interior light illuminating his face for a fleeting second, revealing a flicker of something that might have been weariness, or perhaps a profound sadness. He slid into the driver's seat, the door closing with a soft click that echoed in the quiet street. The car pulled away, leaving the 2 officers standing in the driveway, bathed in the fading light, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Howard remained on his porch, the wicker chair suddenly feeling like a prison. He was left alone with his shame, with the unsettling realization that the threat he'd perceived hadn't come from the stranger in the suit, but from within himself. The neighborhood, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage for his own private drama. A constant reminder of the day he called the police on his new chief of police. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across Sycamore Lane, the residents of Brookfield, unknowingly, began to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that had been laid bare that afternoon. The truth about their own prejudices, their own complicity in a system that judged a man by the color of his skin, not the content of his character. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across Sycamore Lane, painting the manicured lawns in hues of amber and gold. A thick silence hung in the air, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Officer Bradley Monroe shifted his weight uncomfortably, the polished leather of his holster creaking against his thigh. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple, a stark contrast to the sudden chill that had settled in his gut. Damn it, Caldwell, he thought, of all his eyes darted towards the vacant house, its empty windows staring back like vacant eyes. Just moments ago, this had been a routine call, a suspicious person report. Now it was a minefield. Beside him, Officer Jason Whitaker stood rigid, his youthful face pale and drawn. Whitaker's silence spoke volumes. He was the rookie, fresh out of the academy, and this was a baptism by fire. Leonard Briggs, the newly appointed chief of police, stood motionless, his dark suit absorbing the sunlight. His presence, once perceived as suspicious, now radiated an almost unsettling calm. He held a small, worn leather notebook in his hand, his fingers tracing the embossed initials on the cover. Inside, his mind raced, dissecting the situation with the precision of a surgeon. He hadn't expected this, not so soon. He knew the undercurrents of prejudice ran deep in Brookfield, but this blatant, almost casual racism had caught him off guard. He felt a flicker of anger, a hot, prickly sensation beneath his skin, but he quickly suppressed it. This wasn't about him. This was about something larger, something systemic. "Sir, we weren't aware," Monroe stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He tugged at his collar, the gesture betraying his unease. He could feel the weight of the neighbors' gazes, the silent judgment emanating from behind the lace-curtained windows. This street, this neighborhood, had always been his domain, a place of order and predictability. Now the familiar landscape felt alien, hostile. Briggs' gaze shifted to Monroe, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I'm assuming someone called this in." The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Monroe swallowed hard, glancing towards Howard Caldwell, who stood framed in his living room window. Caldwell's face, usually ruddy and jovial, was now ashen, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and shame. He looked like a trapped animal, caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. "He's digging his own grave," Monroe thought grimly, "and he's taking us down with him." Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, notorious for her meticulously pruned rose bushes and even more meticulously curated social circle, emerged from her house. Her eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, darted between the officers and Chief Briggs, her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. Behind her, the curtains of other houses twitched, revealing curious faces, whispering voices. The quiet street was rapidly transforming into an amphitheater, with Briggs and Caldwell at the center of the unfolding drama. Briggs closed his notebook, the soft thud echoing in the sudden stillness. He turned towards Caldwell's house, his gaze fixed on the older man's reflection in the window. He could see the conflict raging within Caldwell, the shame battling with the stubborn remnants of prejudice. "Mr. Caldwell," Briggs' voice was calm, even gentle, but it carried across the lawn with the clarity of a gunshot. The neighbors, drawn by the sound of his voice, hushed their whispers. "If I were white in this same suit, do you think we'd be having this conversation right now?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. Caldwell's reflection flinched, his eyes darting away, unable to meet Briggs' gaze. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths, with the weight of years of ingrained prejudice, of assumptions made and judgments passed. Briggs held Caldwell's gaze, a silent battle of wills unfolding between them. He saw a flicker of something in Caldwell's eyes, a fleeting glimpse of understanding, perhaps even regret. It was a small victory, a crack in the wall of prejudice. He turned away, his shoulders slumping slightly. The fight was far from over, but this small, silent confrontation had shifted something. The air, once thick with tension, now held a different kind of weight, the weight of realization, of a community forced to confront its own reflection. He knew this wouldn't be the end. It was just the beginning. the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards change. The quiet hum of the lawnmower in the distance seemed to underscore the thought, a persistent, rhythmic reminder of the work that still needed to be done. The front door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the sudden, heavy silence of the house. Howard Caldwell stood frozen, the phantom weight of Leonard Briggs' gaze still pressing on his chest. He turned slowly, each step a labored effort, as if wading through thick molasses. His living room, usually a haven of comforting familiarity, now felt alien, each knick-knack and framed photo a silent accusation. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a chaotic ballet reflecting the turmoil within him. He was in my house, Howard thought, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The chief of police in my living room. He sank into his worn armchair, the springs groaning beneath him, a sound mirroring the groan in his own soul. He could still feel the imprint of Briggs' hand on his firm, steady, unforgiving. Not angry, no, but something far worse. Disappointed, disillusioned, and rightly so, a voice whispered in his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure the image of Briggs standing on his porch, tall and imposing in his dark suit, trying to understand what had driven him, Howard, to make that call. A knock echoed through the room, a sharp rap that made him jump. He knew, with a sickening certainty, who it was. He's come back. He rose slowly, his legs stiff and unsteady, and walked to the door. He opened it to find Briggs standing there, his expression unreadable. "May I come in, Mr. Caldwell?" Howard swallowed, his throat dry. "Yes," he managed, the word barely a whisper. He stepped aside, his body feeling leaden and heavy. Briggs entered, his movements smooth and controlled, filling the small living room with his presence. He stood silently for a moment, surveying the room, his gaze lingering on the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. "Please sit." Howard gestured weakly towards the sofa. Briggs sat, his posture ramrod straight, a stark contrast to Howard's slumped form. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Each tick seemed to amplify the tension, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. "So tell me," Briggs' voice was low and steady, each word carefully enunciated, "what exactly did you see that made you think I was a threat?" Howard flinched, the question a sharp jab to his already bruised ego. He stammered. "Two saw a Manston Dingan front of a vacant house." His voice trailed off, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. He knew they weren't enough. They were a flimsy shield against the truth, a truth he was only now beginning to confront. Briggs' eyes, dark and piercing, held his gaze. "A man in a suit," Briggs clarified, a hint of irony in his voice. "On a warm afternoon, waiting for the movers." Howard's cheeks burned with shame. He looked down at his hands, gnarled and age-spotted, clasped tightly in his lap. A black man in a suit, he thought, the unspoken words a damning indictment. "That's what I really saw. Two made a mistake," he mumbled, the words thick with regret. "Here's the thing, Mr. Caldwell." Briggs' voice, while still calm, carried a weight of profound disappointment. "I moved to this town because I believed in what it stood for: community, sufficient equality. Now I have to ask myself if this town believes in me." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Howard looked up, meeting Briggs' gaze. He saw not anger, but a deep, unsettling sadness, a sadness that mirrored his own. He wanted to explain, to justify, to somehow erase the ugliness that had been exposed. But the words wouldn't come. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound like a hollow excuse. Briggs stood up, his movements deliberate and slow. "I hope," he said, his voice low and resonant, "that you will take some time to reflect on your actions, Mr. Caldwell." He turned and walked towards the door, leaving Howard sitting alone in the heavy silence. The click of the latch echoed in the room, a final punctuation mark on the encounter. Howard remained motionless, the weight of Briggs' words pressing down on him like a physical burden. He closed his eyes, the image of Briggs' face etched with disappointment, seared into his mind. He thought of his grandchildren, their innocent faces flashing before him. He thought of the values he'd tried to instill in them, the lessons he'd taught them about fairness and equality. And he felt a wave of shame so profound it threatened to engulf him. What kind of example have I set? He wondered, the question a painful barb at his heart. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent, chaotic ballet reflecting the turmoil within him. He sat there, alone in the silence, grappling with the uncomfortable truth that he, Howard Caldwell, a man who prided himself on his sense of community and justice, had betrayed the very values he held dear. The silence stretched on, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a stark reminder of the time that had passed, the time he could never get back, the time he would now spend trying to reconcile the man he thought he was with the man he had revealed himself to be. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was suddenly deafening. Each tick was a hammer blow against the fragile quiet that had settled over the house, a quiet heavy with the unspoken. Howard Caldwell sat in his worn armchair, the floral pattern of the upholstery blurred by the unshed tears stinging his eyes. The afternoon sun, once a comforting warmth, now felt like a spotlight, exposing the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny accusation. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the remote, clicking the television on, then off again. The silence was preferable to the inane chatter of daytime programming. He couldn't escape the echo of his own voice, strained with suspicion, reporting a suspicious individual to the police. Suspicions rooted not in fact, but in the dark soil of prejudice he hadn't realized had taken root so deeply within him. He shifted in his chair, the familiar creak of the springs a jarring sound in the otherwise oppressive stillness. He'd lived in this house for 42 years. 42 years of barbecues on the patio, holiday gatherings around the fireplace, a lifetime of memories woven into the very fabric of this place. Now, it felt tainted, stained by the ugliness he'd unleashed. He'd always considered himself a good man, a pillar of the community. He volunteered at the church, kept his lawn meticulously manicured, waved to his neighbors every morning. He'd built a life on the bedrock of what he believed to be decency. But what good was surface-level decency when it masked something so insidious beneath? His gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Him and Martha, their faces young and hopeful, squinting against the bright California sun on their honeymoon. Martha, with her quick wit and infectious laugh, always ready with a kind word, a gentle nudge toward understanding. What would she think? Shame, a hot flush creeping up his neck, tightened its grip. He knew what she'd think. She'd seen the subtle prejudices lurking in the shadows of his pronouncements, the offhand comments he'd dismissed as harmless. She tried, gently, patiently, to chip away at the wall he'd built around his own narrow worldview. He hadn't listened. Now, the wall had crumbled, revealing the ugliness he'd tried so hard to ignore. He closed his eyes, the image of Chief Briggs' face, calm and composed, burned into his mind. The quiet dignity in those eyes, a silent reproach that cut deeper than any shouted accusation. He'd looked at Briggs, a man sworn to protect and serve his community, and seen not a fellow human being, but a threat defined not by actions, but by the color of his skin. The realization was a physical blow, a sickening twist in his gut. How could he, a man who prided himself on his fairness, have fallen prey to such baseless fear? How many times the words escaped him, a whisper lost in the cavernous silence of the room? How many times do we assume the worst based on nothing but what we think we know? The internal monologue echoed the shame gnawing at his conscience. How many times had he judged, categorized, and dismissed people based on preconceived notions, on the narratives he'd absorbed without question? He'd seen a black man in a suit, standing in front of a vacant house, and his mind had immediately filled in the blanks, painting a picture of suspicion and danger. He hadn't seen a person. He'd seen a stereotype. He rubbed his temples, try to massage away the throbbing headache that had taken root. The shame was a heavy weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He'd not only wronged Chief Briggs, he'd exposed the insidious undercurrent of prejudice that ran through their seemingly idyllic community. The uncomfortable silence of the other officers, the averted gazes of his neighbors, spoke volumes. They'd all seen it, the ugliness he'd revealed. They'd all, perhaps, recognized a part of themselves in his actions, a part they'd rather keep hidden. He thought of Officer Monroe, a man he'd known for years, his initial suspicion mirroring Howard's own, quickly replaced by a discomfiting awareness. And young Whitaker, the barely perceptible flinch when Chief Briggs revealed his identity. It wasn't just him. This prejudice was a disease, a silent infection that had spread through their community, festering beneath the surface of polite smiles and neighborly waves. He'd ripped off the bandage, exposing the wound for all to see. And now, they all had to confront it. He stood up, his legs stiff and unsteady, and walked to the window. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his perfectly manicured lawn, the very symbol of the order and control he'd strived to maintain. But true order, he realized, couldn't be achieved by simply trimming the edges of the lawn. The weeds had to be pulled up by the roots, the soil tilled and renewed. The work would be difficult, painful, but necessary. He had to confront the ugliness within himself, acknowledge the biases he'd held onto for so long, and actively work to dismantle them. He looked out at the quiet street, at the houses lined up like dominoes, each one holding its own secrets, its own unspoken prejudices. This wasn't just about him. This was about Brookfield, about the country, about the insidious nature of prejudice that permeated every aspect of their lives. The change wouldn't happen overnight. It would be a slow, arduous process, a constant battle against the ingrained narratives that shaped their perceptions. But it had to start somewhere. It had to start with him. He had to be better. They all had to be better. The silence of the afternoon pressed in on him, no longer accusatory, but expectant. The silence of a community holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next.